Okay, so this goes back to the chapter before the one that we are reading, that we're about to read on the attachment theory. In the chapter before that, we talked about how certain concepts are not neatly defined. And do you remember what's the alternative to this neatly defined way, or the neat definition of concepts? What was the alternative that we talked about in some of the other classes? So there was a psychologist in the 70s who came up with a theory of concepts used by people in ordinary life, which was called what? Or if you don't remember the name of it, what was the essence of it? What was the idea? Yeah, prototypes, right. So prototype theory, right, was a theory that was proposed as an account of our ordinary concepts, or the way that we use concepts in ordinary life. So prior to that, philosophers will still do this, but prior to that, philosophers would take a concept and think about it in conceptual terms. For instance, you can take the concept of bachelor, and then you can forget about all the trigger cases, and then you can give a definition of a bachelor, right? You can analyze it in terms of its components. So a bachelor has to be unmarried, and as the term normally is used, it has to be a man. And then there might be other restrictions on it. Maybe it has to be an adult, and so on. But the idea is that, in principle, we can do that to concepts. We can give a conceptual analysis of concepts. And that's in terms of a definition, or in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. And that's simple when you have concepts like bachelor, right? Which is almost the way that we think of that concept, almost has its constituents right there. It's also simple when we think about math. So if you take the concept of an even number, you can figure out, or taught, that for a number to be even, you have to be able to divide it by the number 2. So that's one way to define, characterize the number even. And for any even number, you can define even that way. But there are lots of concepts, the way that we use them in ordinary life. Eleanor Rush, the one who came up with prototype theory, thought that the way that we use concepts in ordinary life is not quite that way. We don't have these necessary and sufficient conditions for all the concepts that we use. Instead, she thought we have certain prototypes, either prototypes as the actual items or prototype concepts for each category, and then other concepts, related concepts, or other items are categorized in relation to these prototypes. And so she did a number of studies showing, for instance, what a prototype would be for categories like furniture, or categories like bird, by asking how good an example a certain item would be of, say, a furniture or a bird. And so she found that chairs and tables are very good examples of furniture. A telephone would not be a very good example of furniture. A rug would be maybe somewhere in between. A walk-in closet would not be a very good example of a piece of furniture, apparently, because it can't be moved around. And for birds, right, so it's not going to be chickens necessarily that are the best examples of birds. Rather, it would be something like a robin would be the best example, and then we'll go further out into the more what we call borderline cases. And we're repeating a similar experiments, study, where we used movie clips from various different movies, and we had subjects say how good examples these movie clips were of various categories, so compassionate love, true love, romantic love, and so on. And what we found basically was that the very warm scenes that seemed to show a reconnection between two people who had been together for a long time, or people who just had been together for a long time, and commitment and so on, long-term commitment. They were not the kinds of situations that people would classify as the true love. Maybe compassionate love in some cases, but not, they weren't scoring as high on the true love, in the true love or romantic love category. Whereas your typical Hollywood scene at the end of a romantic comedy or a romantic Hollywood movie would score very high. And that's not to say that that's what love is, it's to say that that seems to be one way that people are using the concepts. So we were talking about that as also illustrating that that the concept of love is not sort of an on-off affair, because you can have very good examples according to people of true love, but then you can have other cases that are better examples of true love than others. Right? So you get a scale instead of just sort of love or not. So that was one piece of evidence that we used to talk about love as a kind of degree notion, that love can come in degrees, that is not an on-off affair. And then we also we looked at the language. We used data from philosophy of language or linguistics to give some more evidence for that, because the way that the word love is used, we talk as if you can love one person more than another, and you can love the same person a little bit or a lot. You can love that person a lot one day, and not the next day, and you can love more than one person, and so on. And so we talked about that, how the word love is more like the word huge or even big. Right? So if you talk about a huge apartment, well, that will of course also be context driven. What is a huge apartment, right? Or a big apartment. So something that's a big apartment here may not be a big apartment in some other outside of the city. Something that's a small apartment here may not be a small apartment in Manhattan, New York City, or downtown LA. And so that's that context, that's a contextual element that goes into defining these adjectives like big and also rich would be the same, or expensive, or huge. So these are adjectives that depend on context. But what they're gradable adjectives. And by gradable adjectives, we mean that they satisfy certain things. I mean, they take modifiers, as we just talked about, right? So, I mean, first of all, I mean, you can compare them. So they're comparatives. You can compare them, like, so one apartment is bigger than another. You can also say that an apartment is not all that big, or it's quite big. So you can put in these qualifiers that in front of the words that sort of qualifies what you mean by the word, but also it sort of restricts it. So an apartment that's quite big may not be as big as very big, right? So you have, again, a degree notion or a gradable adjective. And so we talked about love being a gradable verb, that we also can do some of the same things in terms of the language about love, and that's is sort of evidence of how we use the term. Not necessarily, or none of this is really evidence for what love is, but it's evidence for that the way we use the term love, concept love, we don't really use it in an on-off fashion, except in very special situations, such as when we ask someone, do you love me? And we expect this yes or no answer, even though, of course, the correct answers we talked about would be something like, well, that depends. I mean, can you qualify that? First, what do you mean by love, right? Do you mean friendship love? Maybe that's given in the context, but friendship love, romantic love. But so the context might settle that, but then the further questions, I mean, what kind of scale are we talking about, right? I mean, there's not. You could be loving someone a lot. You can be loving someone a little. You could also be in the gray zone and sort of in the in between. And that was sort of the main point of the last chapter. And in this chapter on attachment theory, that notion becomes relevant because in many cases what people experience if they have an insecure attachment style is something that might be described correctly as an in-between case of love. And so just to repeat what we talked about last time, we go from there, is that there are two kinds of attachment styles. So there would be the avoidant, and then there would be the anxious attachment style. And both of these are insecure attachment styles. And then somewhere in the middle here, if we draw it on a scale, on a spectrum, we would have the secure attachment style. And so according to attachment theory, these attachment styles are laid down in the first 5 years of life, and how they're laid down depends on, according to this theory, on how the child copes with a not fully ideal environment to grow up in. So if you had an ideal childhood environment to grow up in, then that doesn't mean that you couldn't develop any of these attachment styles that are insecure, because you can still develop them later. Maybe you have a lot of failed relationships that might develop one attachment style rather than the other. It could also be that just your interaction with your peers could provoke something like that. But so just growing up in a secure childhood setting would not be enough to get a secure attachment style. But according to attachment theory, this is the starting point. You have to have secure environments. First of all, or that's at least the most likely path to a secure attachment style, is the secure starting point. And that means that you have to have at least one caregiver who will be there to protect you, but not protect you so much that you can explore. So it's sort of a fine balance between allowing the child to explore relative to the child's age, so age-appropriate exploration of the world at the same time as the safety net is there. So the child feels safe to explore. It's basically the foundation for the secure attachment. And that very often goes wrong. It can go wrong just in little ways or in big ways. So it could be that parents are overprotective, so the child doesn't get to explore. It could be that the parents simply are not there emotionally, that the parents are acting cold. It could be that the parents are not there physically, or are rarely there because they're working large number of jobs. It can be so many different things. It can be from abuse to something that's more like negligence to something that's just unavoidable because of that the parents have to work all the time because they have to make money. It's the only way they can make money, and so the kids are always on their own. It can be so many different things. And so the child is going to cope. So if the child is working in a typical way, it's going to cope with that. And the coping strategies are, according to research, very much the same. Kids use the same coping strategies to start out with. So they will try different things. And the coping can be to seek attention, right? So to become more clingy, to constantly seek attention. The coping can also be to withdraw and to find, maybe in the best of cases, find some interests that have nothing to do with the parents. So the kid might just withdraw to his or her room and engage with something else there. But according to attachment theory, at least one thing that determines where you will be in the scale will depend on not which coping mechanism you started out with, but which one actually worked for you. So I guess there's a psychological element to that as well, that what works for you as a coping mechanism, well, that might depend on which person you are, but it also might depend very much on the environment. It could depend on which parents you have, how are they going to respond to your coping mechanism. So if you seek a lot of attention, and if that, hey, look at me, I need some attention, if that helps, then one way to cope with, say, cold parents or parents who don't pay enough attention would be for the child then to seek out that attention and get that attention that they need. And so they would end up, or tend to end up, on the more anxious side of the secure line. Or it could be that it works a lot better when they withdraw. They might find that the parents are not quite as cold or are not emotionally abusive or verbally abusive if they just withdraw from the situation. And in that case, withdrawing would often put them on the other side, and they will have a more avoidant attachment style. And then, of course, this is, or can be, situation dependent. So what we sometimes talk about, we do sometimes talk about fluctuating attachment style, or even, this is might not be the best term for it, but a bipolar attachment style. Which would be in contrast to something very different from bipolar disorder, where bipolar disorder is actually a mood disorder. So in bipolar disorder, it's basically phases of mania and then phases of depressed mood. But the bipolar or fluctuating attachment style would be when you react in different ways. For instance, it could be when you react in different ways to different people. This is not completely, I mean, this is a quite normal way of reacting a little bit. I mean, if you meet someone who is extremely clingy, your first reaction, most people's first reaction would be to actually withdraw. Because if they're very clingy, you withdraw. If you meet someone who is actually already withdrawing, but you have an interest in them, you will naturally approach. So it's natural to have different ways of reacting to other people. But there are also people who, independently of that, will, for whatever reasons that they don't have conscious access to, will act clingy with some people and not with others. And not because there's necessarily a difference between these people in terms of how they withdraw or in terms of their attachment style, but simply because something about these people can trigger different ways of feeling secure with these people. So it's not, it doesn't have to be the case that if you think that you're often avoidant, say that you're always avoidant. You could suddenly find yourself in a situation where you're not, or the other way around, and that can depend on factors that you often don't have conscious access to. So you can't sort of bring them up and say, oh, that's why I'm reacting this way. So just to say a little bit about personality, because these attachment styles are not thought to be personality traits in a standard sense. So there's one way to, a more mainstream way to categorize personality in the book, but there's also something called the Big Five, which is another way. Big Five of personality, and it's what many people in psychology operate with, and you can think of them as dimensions, the Big Five. Sort of personality traits, but traits that are opposed to each other. So you have extroverted, which will be opposed to the introverted. So the extroverted versus the introverted. So in the very simple outline of the extroverted versus introverted, the extroverted would be a person who likes to be around other people, who is talkative and good in social situations, who might take steps to get to know new people in those situations, and in general has a good time in social settings. The introverted is someone who, in the extreme case, is someone who does not have a good time in social settings, or at least does not have as good a time in social settings as they do by themselves. So introverted would be someone who prefers to be alone. And of course, that again is, you can be more or less introverted, more or less extroverted. Again, that comes on a scale. And there are lots of introverts who are really good in social situations, but will need some space regularly. Maybe everyone needs space regularly, but they will need more of it if they're introverts. So they will need more of it than, say, your average person. And they may be good in social situations because they have learned to be good in social situations. It may be that they have a job or are going through a kind of education that requires them to be good to some extent in social situations. So the introverted is not, you can't always determine that someone is introverted by simply looking at whether they can actually manage in a social situation, because it could be that they have being forced by the nature of their job and so on to actually, deal with social situations. That could still mean that they really prefer long stretches of time alone. And that's sort of what. It's more sort of how they prefer, how they feel about it. What they would prefer, other things being equal, that would be a better way to define introverted versus extroverted. I mean, in principle, I guess you could have an extroverted who, because of a particular job or environment that the extroverted person finds himself or herself in, that she has to deal with long stretches of being alone and maybe learns, even though she prefers social groups, learns to cope with that and functions well in spite of that. So these are, you have to remember, so these are I just thought of as traits of personality. So being introverted or extroverted is not, it's not a disorder, it's not a condition. That's just a way that you would classify people when you classify them in terms of their personality. In order to get disorders, we have to get to some extremes on these scales that we'll get to. Then we can have the neurotic. Versus, and so you can put a lot of different things on the other side, but basically someone who's not neurotic, which could be someone who's calm, composed, self-confident, say, let's just put that down. Here, that's not one opposing category here. It's more like either you have the neurotic trait or you don't, basically. And that, of course, by that I mean you can have more or less of it, of course. But if you don't have it, then it would be something like composed or something like that. So the very neurotic would have more of a tendency to read a lot into to little things and get anxious about it. So a neurotic person would probably tend to be more sensitive, psychologically speaking, would not be able to brush off criticism and insults. It's not everyone who's neurotic who will behave in this way, but it's also someone, I mean, the typical person, I mean, so a good one, good character in movies, and also a director and an actor who's playing a neurotic person in most of his movies is Woody Allen, right? He's sort of your typical example of a neurotic person. So, of course, that's part of what makes some of these movies funny. But neurotic people also tend to have a higher levels of basic anxiety. So even if you wouldn't actually say, oh, they have an anxiety disorder, their base level would tend to be higher in terms of anxiety. And then they can have other things like features that we also see and take to be stereotypical of neuroticism, such as double checking, right, 5 times if you actually locked the door, or if you turned off the stove top, or if you actually remember to unplug the iron that you used this morning to straighten out your shirt, and so on. So that's another feature of personality. Right. Then there's also the agreeable versus, again, the opposing category sort of takes a little more description to describe the opposing category, but agreeable, one word that might be good might be difficult. a difficult person, sort of in an everyday sense of the word difficult. So a difficult person, someone who's difficult to deal with, as opposed to agreeable. So you can think of the agreeable person as being more easy to deal with. Is not going to say if it's someone you work with. It's not going to raise an issue every time you are proposing something new or you're handing in something. It's not going to raise issues every time. So the difficult person is someone who could have really extremely too high standards, for instance, for what it takes to do your job, right? So it might be difficult in that way. And the agreeable person might have more normal standards. But this can be laid out in various different ways. But basically, agreeable is a person that's easy to be around, and a difficult person is a person that's not easy to be around. And then there's also openness. Again, we can put many different words on the other side of open. If you're open in this sense, you're also curious. That's a sense that psychologists tend to have in mind, that if you're an open person, if you have the trait of openness, then you're a curious person. So if you're curious, you have an interest in exploring new things. You also have an interest in other people's opinions. Maybe not all of these, but these are some things that you could have. So you're open to other people's opinions, you're open to new viewpoints, you're open to new scientific discoveries, you're open to try new things, you're open to taste new food, you're open to do something you have never done. So you can put a lot of words on the other side here, but of course one that could be like dogmatic. Dogmatic, closed-minded. And so, if you're not open, you would probably stick to pretty much your routine, and that doesn't mean just the way you do things in the morning before you go to school. It would also mean that you basically have your repertoire of food that you eat, and if anyone is going to propose that you eat something else, you're just not going to do it because you're not going to risk tasting something you don't like. That would be even more dogmatic. You're not curious, so you also might tend to have more set beliefs, right? So you might not be as open to other people's viewpoints. You might find people strange if they have different viewpoints than you do, and so on. And then last one. This is not necessarily a specific order. I put them in here. It's just the 5. So conscientious versus a conscientious person is, again, I mean, it's a number of features, of course, that it takes to be conscientious, and to be it to some degree, it takes some of those features and so on. But one feature would be that you are organized, could be a way to be conscientious. If you're a planner, if you're a type of person who plans a lot, and maybe not because you're forced to, because you're working in an office where your boss tells you that, well, now you have to plan this, this, and this, and this, that wouldn't necessarily make you that kind of person. But if you naturally like to plan ahead and have things in order in your calendar, and if you're organized in general in your life, it does not have to necessarily include that you have this you live in this room or apartment and it's complete. It's never messy. It's not necessarily organized in that way. It's more that your life is organized. Your life is planned and organized versus so we can say disorganized. So the disorganized person would tend to be the person who might be more spontaneous, at least in terms of planning, and who may not have things ready when they say they do, who may not actually have thought of what they're doing tomorrow. If you ask them, they might not have that clear in their minds. So these are basically the 5 traits of the big 5. As you can see, the way they're laid out in the book, it's similar. This is just labeled slightly differently, a little more friendly to sort of, a little more mainstream. But these are the big 5, and so what you do is that you can take personality tests, which you can do online. Got lots of them online. They will ask you questions. They won't ask you, are you introverted, or are you agreeable, or are you organized? Instead, they will ask you, so in this situation, what would you do? Find out Berit questions, or how do you feel about the following situation? And then it will calculate where you are on the scale for each of these, how extroverted, introverted you are, how neurotic, not neurotic you are, how agreeable you are, how open you are, and how conscientious you are. And it just happens to be that most people, when they take these tests, which are very easy to find online because some of the tests online, the best of the tests online are very, very similar to the tests that personality psychologists would use. So you will get, your ratings in those will tend to be the big 5 ratings. Otherwise, if it's not in terms of this, it wouldn't be the real test. But most people then, so we took this to be the extreme extrovert, this to be the extreme introvert, and so on for all the traits here. There'll be sort of midpoint, right? And most people will find themselves maybe they'll be slightly introverted. It's just an example. Maybe they'll be a tiny bit neurotic. Maybe they're also a tiny bit difficult to deal with. Maybe they're not so happy about trying new things, but sometimes they do it. And maybe they're, say, conscientious, so they're still planning their life a lot, organizing life a lot. So it'll look like this, right? So there will be one rating like this, and then another person, so this could be one of your ratings, and then another person will have one that looks almost the same, except these might be squeezed around a little. But most people will have something like that. And then you have some people who might have one outlier, meaning they might have most of these, but they might be so introverted, say, that they're almost out here on one of the scales, so the one of the scales is sort of extreme for their case. But often what happens when you have personality disorder is that something is going completely overboard. Right, so if we say that these are even the scales where you will find people on, and most people are even in the middle, some might lie a little up here. You might have a personality disorder, so you could have neuroticism that becomes or is a disorder. So neuroticism is not thought to be a disorder when it's up here. It's thought to be a way you are, a trait. But if a person is out here for neuroticism, say, right? Extreme neurotic, then it can become a disorder. And what they're trying to work towards right now with DSM-5 is that whether it is a disorder or not will also depend on whether you function. So are you high functioning? And high functioning person is someone who can take care of their lives, even if their lives are messy, they still take care of their lives. They make it through whatever, if they're at a university, they make it through the university, they get a job, or at least if they don't get a job, it's not because they didn't try, and so on. And so that's kind of a high functioning person. When people are not high functioning, they can't do that, right? So they just can't. And the cats shouldn't be understood here. They can't because they're lazy. That would be a different personality trait. A different reason. If we're looking at the neuroticism, the reason they couldn't do it in that case would be because of their extreme neuroticism, which interfere with high functioning life. And then we have a disorder, or at least that's what they're moving towards in DSM-5, the new manual that's coming out. So you can sort of see where different well-known disorders might lie. So you could look at the classic narcissism. So narcissistic personality disorder, in the classic sense, there are actually many variations on this because a lot of the studies that are done on college students, and it turns out that narcissists actually change. I mean, they don't necessarily change personality-wise. I mean, probably not, but they change in how it's manifested. But the studies seem to show that someone with an extreme narcissistic personality disorder who is also a college student, which is often the research subjects that psychologists use, will tend to be extremely extroverted, at least in the behavior you can observe. Might be tons of insecurity underlying that, of course. Right, so they would be out here, right? And it would be like the opposite of the neurotic, right? So they would show a lot of confidence. Again, we're talking about a specific group of people with narcissistic personality disorder, namely those that are mostly studied. So they're up here for that one. They do not tend to be agreeable, but here it doesn't have to be on the extremely difficult side, but they're certainly out on the more difficult side. And then they're conscientious. I'm going to save this for a second, the openness. They're conscientious in a way that is off. It's off in the sense that they would tend to be very calculating. So someone with a very severe narcissistic personality disorder would be calculating. They're using people. It's not a coincidence if they want to give someone a compliment. It's not typically genuine. It has a purpose. Right? So they're conscientious in that sense, though it doesn't really fit very well in this category because they're not conscientious in the sense that they wouldn't be impulsive, because there's actually a lot of people with narcissistic personality disorder who have a tendency to be very impulsive, and by impulsive, we can include things like they might, have an alcohol problem, they might have a drug problem, they might go out and spend a lot of money and not think about the consequences. So they're kind of off this. Yeah, they're conscientious in the way that they act, in the planning sense of that, but they're not conscientious with respect to their own resources, typically. They're also, according to some studies, more likely to go out and engage in unprotected sex multiple times, and that's not in the conscientious category. So they're sort of just off the chart. They don't fit into that category. Again, open, dogmatic. Well, the way that they will come across is as open, typically, right? Because they will approach people. They have the confidence to approach people, and to want to try new things. So you can probably put them in the open category. But what we see here is that, in some cases, what makes it a disorder is the extremes. Either they are on the extreme side of the scale, very extroverted, very not neurotic. So difficult, they don't have to be very difficult, it could be a little difficult. But at least for these two, very extroverted, very not neurotic, maybe they're very open-minded, but then they can sort of not even fit. In some sense, that behavior is too fluctuating or too off the norm to even fit a category, because it's kind of hard to say whether someone with a narcissistic personality disorder is conscientious or not. Well, they're not conscientious typically if conscientious also means that you take care of yourself, that you don't have an alcohol problem, or that you don't use drugs every day, or that you don't go out and spend all your money in one night, or that you don't go out and have unprotected sex with 50 strangers. That would be one way to be conscientious. But there's also a part of being conscientious is also the planning part. And to be calculating is a way of planning. It's not a good way. It's not a good way of planning, but it's to calculate. If you're calculating, you're using people, and so everything you do will have a purpose. There'll be a reason for you doing it. And so often when people have a personality disorder, they just don't fit the categories, or they fit them to an extreme that you don't normally see. And then if you go to the next manual that comes out, you will also look at whether they can function. Can they function actually? And function on a high level. If they can function on a high level, then in the new manual, they wouldn't have a disorder. It wouldn't be a personality disorder. But the attachment style, of course, in both directions actually can become a disorder. That doesn't make the attachment style or the difficulties with attachment, it doesn't make that a personality disorder, it just makes it a disorder. And yeah, of course, as Sarah brought up last time, it could be triggered by your personality. I mean, how bad your avoidant or anxious attachment style is going to be certainly can be affected by your personality, because you can see how certain coping mechanisms might work for some people but not for others. So if we go back and let's say that personality is also something that's starting to be manifested in children, even though we say that we develop our personality also over the first 25 years of our lives. The idea is that part of our personality probably is something that we have early on or show signs of early on. And let's say that a child is on the neurotic side, right? So more anxious. Well, if they're already more anxious, it's not surprising if the coping mechanisms that work for them are the coping mechanisms that work for people who are more anxious, with an anxious attachment style. If a person is, say, introverted a child is introverted and also quite confident, it may be easier for that child to cope with issues with the parents by becoming more avoidant and just sort of turn to themselves. And if they have, well, maybe regardless of whether they have the confidence, but if they're not neurotic, they may be able to handle being with themselves most of the time better than if they were neurotic and would need perhaps people around to make them feel better. So this is basically where what's outlined in that chapter, and it fits a couple of the topics of a couple of the other chapters. It fits the chapter on that there are things that determine how you act and behave as a person which you don't have conscious access to, and there are also lots of cases where you won't be able to tell on a conscious level whether you are in love with a person or whether that you are sufficiently in love with a person, because in this case, if you have an anxious attachment style, or you disorder, or an avoidant attachment disorder, or an avoidant attachment style, then you're going to be insecure about attachment. And so it's hard for most people to tell whether they love a person if they also have an insecure attachment style, because at least if it's romantic love, those two things tend to come together. That if you love someone, well, then at some point at least you should get attached to them, right? But you have a problem with that, and then you may think that maybe you don't love them, or you don't love them not enough, because you obviously can't make a commitment. So those are typically very good cases of the in-between cases in terms of what we have conscious access to. Okay, should we do a little discussion here?
Yeah, sure. Maybe kind of good. Maybe if we split off into groups and then kind of continue the discussion about maybe tying in the big 5 personalities into different